Hello and welcome to the Jessie James Beads Facebook premiere. I'm Jem Hawkes. If we've not met before, I make wire work and I'm from United Kingdom. I live slap bang in the middle of England. I hope you're having a beautiful day or evening or morning or whatever time of day it is wherever you are in the world. Today I'm going to be working with one of the absolutely magnificent Colour Trends bead boxes, and I chose Unicorn Bliss because who doesn't love a bit of magic in their lives? So I'm going to show you the piece that we will learn to make today, but Sarah thought it would be quite funny and quite interesting for you to see the process from beginning to end. So I'm also going to show you some other pieces that I made before I came up with this design, so you get to see a little bit more of the creative process, how it starts on the drawing board all the way through to the finished product. So this is the Unicorn Cameo pendant, or well, it's not technically a pendant, is it? I mean, I might wear it, but it's technically wall art or a window sunlight catcher, something like that. You could even put it on a coil of wire and have that spinning around in the garden. They are absolutely stunning beads, really beautiful colourways to work with. So I hope that you enjoy this project with me today. As I say, we're working with a Colour Trends bead mix in Unicorn Bliss. I've chosen to work with 2 gauges of wire today, one which is a 16 gauge, which is approximately equivalent to 1.25mm. Now it's a little bit tougher to get to form those shapes if you are brand new to wire working. However, because I want this to last for years and years to come, I thought it was important to make it with a slightly heavier gauge wire. And equally, rather than using a superfine 26 gauge, which is equivalent to 0.4mm, I've chosen to use the 24 gauge wire for all of the winding. Just means that you can see slightly more of it, which is really lovely on some of those key weaving points, especially just down there on the withers. If your unicorn was a horse, I think they'd be called withers. It's been a long time since I was in a stable though, so maybe I've forgotten what those technical terms are. Anyway, if you'd like to join me down at the board, I will show you this little chap a little bit more closely, and then we'll have a bit of a giggle at some of my design errors that led us here. So here's the piece that we're going to be working on today, which I'd love any name suggestions that you might have for our beautiful unicorn. I have always been interested in mythical beasties such as unicorns and dragons. I've got a massive collection of dragons, not actual living ones, but statues of them. So the reason I've called this the Unicorn Bliss Cameo is because when I started to generate the design, it reminded me of late 1800s, early 1900s shell cameos, which have this kind of particular shaping on the neckline. So do go and have a look if you've never seen one. They're a fascinating part of jewellery design. But I'm going to show you to begin with how to create the shape in the centre, and then I'll give you a quick run through of creating a frame for your unicorn. Now Sarah and I had a bit of a chat earlier on in the week, and Sarah thought it would be quite fun to show you my design process, basically how we got to here from a reel of wire and a box of beads. So please forgive me, I am not an artist. I cannot draw or paint. I work with wire as best as I possibly can. So when I first started thinking about this, this was what I was looking to create, something along these lines. And rather than spend hours coiling wire that perhaps would be a little bit tiresome on your fingers, I chose to work with the bead shapes that were included in the pot. So that's what was on my mind to begin with. And this is where we got to. So there's quite a lot of difference, but you can see the general idea is carried through. Now something else that Sarah thought it would be fun to show you are the other types of unicorn shape that I made before I ended up with this design. So the very first one I came up with, he's a little bit hench, a little bit chubby, looks a bit more like a battle rhino than a unicorn, but I still kind of liked him anyway. So then I kind of refined the idea a little bit with these two. I think this one looks more like a deer of some description, but still, never mind. What I discovered when I was making these two, these are both in 18 gauge wire, is that they're not really firm enough. So I moved to a different wire. This is actually some round wire that I put through my rolling mill to create a squishy oval wire, which generated this quite hefty looking unicorn, which was quite good fun to work with. And I think I'm going to embellish him later and turn him into something else along the line. So what I finally turned to was this design, which is what I'm going to show you how to make today. So to begin with, what I'm going to show you is forming the basic shape, and then I will move on to weaving that section together to generate a nice supportive main segment. And then I'll show you how to add all of those beads and add the little droppers onto the bottom of the design. So because we've got the camera a little bit closer than we used to have to prevent it zooming in and out, what I'm going to have to do is move this out of the way. Normally I'd pop it up for reference, but what that means is that it will be a little bit intrusive and I'll probably end up knocking it on the floor. So if you need to take a screen grab of that and put it to one side in the bottom corner, then do, but that's what we're going to look to make today. So the wire that I'm working with is silver plated copper. It's in a German style, so it's fairly sturdy. And I'm looking here at around about 16 inches or so. And this is in the 16 gauge, which is 1.25mm gauge. Now obviously this can be sized up or down. I'm making it for wall art or a window hanging or a sunlight catcher, but you can absolutely design that however you desire. You could size it down and make it into jewellery if you wanted to. So what I'm going to do as ever is grip hold of one end. I just need to make sure that both of those ends are nice and smooth. And I'm going to draw my finger and thumb over the wire 3 times just to add a little bit of warmth and fluidity. Now we're going to start up at the top of the neck on the inside of the design. And if I pop this bear variation in, this is pre having those beautiful beads from the bead box added in, we're going to start just here and move on down this line, create that cameo neckline, and then move on around the shape from there. So let me just pop that back out of the way for now. I'm going to start by making sure that your wire is nice and smooth, and then just having a very, very gentle curvature coming down. It's almost imperceptible, just a gentle curve. And then when you get to the base of the design, when you decide that's how long you want the neck to be, I'm going to go for a really sharp bend and then draw that back so it's almost flat. Almost, but not quite, it's just slightly inside. And then I'm going to draw the wire down so that we get that shape which is reminiscent of the cameo. I'm going to come along, this is probably about 1.5 inches, maybe a slightly smaller than that, 1.25 inches perhaps, before I make a bend and bring that really firmly back upwards. Now because I'm working with quite a long length of wire and I'm trying to keep that as still as possible for you, sometimes the end of the wire is going to catch on things. So if you hear a bang, that's just something on my desk. So we're going to bring this up the neckline. This is the front of the neck of our unicorn, and I'm just going to gently warm that as I go. Now you can obviously make this smaller or larger as you go. Just before I get to the top, I'm going to pop my pliers in. So you can see here it's about maybe 1/3 of an inch. And what I need to do is make a bend coming in this direction. Now this is where beads will go flying because of the length of the wire I'm working with. So that is coming back towards the starting point. And I'm just allowing that to curve very gently. I don't want to lose that curve. I'm actually going to use it. Now what we're doing is we're creating the jawline of our unicorn. So that can go in as deep or as shallow as you want it to. And I need that to be the hairpin racetrack design that we've talked about before. So at the moment that's far too open. What we need to do is squeeze this closed. Now when you're working with a slightly heavier wire like this 16 gauge, it's much easier to achieve in an 18 gauge, but with the 16 gauge, when you squash this together, and this is the action we're going to be taking, what will happen is the wire will want to twist so that one will go on top of the other because it's the path of least resistance for the wire. What you need to do is try and enclose the very end bit, the hairpin bend section, quite close to the box joint, but not into the box joint, otherwise you can mark it. Because what I can do here is generate more pressure using less power of my hands. The closer you are to that box joint, the more pressure you can exert. So I'm just trying to get that really nicely closed up. Now we don't need to add any wire in between this hairpin, so it can be super squished together. and we're looking to get that coming back on itself really, really neatly. Now, if you want to, you can make this a very, very firm bend, so it's a little bit more anatomically correct, but you don't have to worry too much because this is your unicorn and you can decide how that's going to work for you. So again, I'm just going to use my finger to generate a little bit of warmth and to generate that lovely jawline, I suppose, the big disc that appears on the side of his face or her face. So once I've got a little bit of a bend coming at the end here, I'm going to switch the grip of my pliers and then put a little bit of straightness coming away before I gently curve that down slightly. And then we're going to create my favourite part on, I imagine, a unicorn, but very definitely on a horse, which is the chin. So I'm going to generate that by just pushing my finger down in to generate that chin shape. If that isn't going to work for you, you can use your pliers to make that a little bit firmer, like so. So we've got a little dimpled chin, which is usually super velvety soft. And then we need to just have a very gentle point, which will replicate the very, very nose, I suppose, the tip of the nose, and bring that back up over the bridge of the nose. So I'm reasonably happy with that. You could add nostrils if you really wanted to, but what I'm going to do is grip the wire like so and just bring it down ever so slightly. So I'm just going to add a very, very gentle bend, very, very almost imperceptible again, before coming back along. And it's usually sort of halfway between where that jawline starts to move inwards and the very, very end. We're going to put an upright in to kind of look a little bit like where your eyes might, or the forehead, I suppose. Do unicorns have foreheads? Good question. And then flat, slightly down. So you could imagine if you were going to put a bead in for the eye would be in this kind of region. If you need help, all I did was look at pictures of unicorns and horses on the internet. Use your favourite browser and just find a nice image to work from if you want to have something that's really anatomically a little bit more correct than mine. So once I've got a little bit of space for where I imagine the eye would be, I need an upright bend, and I need this to be coming ever so slightly forwards. So I'm going to pinch very, very firmly and draw that wire up and forwards. So there's quite a sharp angle, but not necessarily a sharp bend. Now what I need to do is generate space for 4 beads to sit inside this framework, which is the unicorn's horn. So I'm going to hold on to the horn section and just make 4 little zigzags going up. So 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 1 out. Do that 4 times, and I'm quite close to the tip of my pliers here. I'm not making very, very large ripples in the wire, but I do want them to be of a similar size. You could, if you wanted to, very gently graduate the size so that they're slightly smaller at the top. As I would imagine, a unicorn's horn does get narrower towards the tip. However, if you do that, your beads might not fit. So be considerate that, and I'll grab one of the beads. This beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, almost aurora borealis finish bead is going to sit in each of these spaces. So when you're creating those bends, that's what's going to fit inside. So keep that in mind when you're making that size decision. So we've got 1 gap, 2 gap, 3 gap, 4 gaps. And then when we get to the top, I'm just going to very gently tilt the wire so that it's slightly pointier. Draw that back down on itself. I do really want to have quite a point on this segment. So what I'm going to do is get as close as I can to the tip of my pliers and draw that back down on itself. Sometimes your pliers are a bit too close to the tip. So I want that to draw back down on itself and then open it back out slightly. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm allowing there to be a little bit more point at the top before bowing the wire very, very gently outwards to make that return journey as we come back down. We're going to go for those 4 ripples again. So that's 1 in that direction. Again, because I'm working with quite a long length of wire, it does tend to catch on things on the desk, and I'm trying to keep this as close to you as possible. So we're going to go for those 4 ripples. And if it goes slightly awry, you can just open that out and make sure that you're happy with it before you continue, because you won't be able to edit it too much later. Like so. and then back in the opposite direction until you've replicated what you did on the first side. So we've got 1, 2, 3 and 4 gaps just here. Now the bend that I'm going to make now that takes us back towards the ear just needs to be ever so slightly further up than the one on the eye side of that unicorn horn. It just doesn't look quite right if it's exactly the same height. I guess that's because the horn is pointing ever so slightly forwards. Doesn't need to be a huge amount, just a tiny, tiny amount. And then I'm going to grip the wire just behind the horn and draw that really sharply up. You can use the pliers to make that bend if you like, so that you keep this gap nice and small. And then what we're going to do is be artful and imagine what the ears of a unicorn might look like. So I'm going to make them relatively horse-like. Little bit of a curve going upwards, and then draw that back down and around, reasonably sharp on the tip, and then slightly broader below before you bring that round in a nice swooshing arc. Now the reason the wire does this for me is because I have very hot hands. If you have cold hands, you might need to just occasionally give that a little bit of a rub, and then the wire will react for you. The next bend that we're going to make is going to be the outside of the main zone. So I'm just going to estimate where I'd like my ear to finish and draw that wire back sharply. Give that a bit of a help if you need to, and then get that wire lovely and warm, because you will want this to be super soft and fluid for the next section. So possibly I've made this jawline a little bit too deep, but I'm not going to worry about it overly. What I need to do now is just make sure that this angle sits correctly. Bring that down from the back of the ear. And what I want to do is have a gently expanding gap between our start point and the back of the mane, or the back of the unicorn's neck, always working in 2 dimensions. So the whole thing should be able to sit flat on a board. There should be no bends coming upwards or away from you. This is all in 2 dimensions. So what I'm going to do is make sure that's super fluid, and then just bring that down and around. So we're very, very close at the top between our start point and where the mane will happen. And then flaring out towards the base, so it's slightly wider at the bottom. So we're now going to add in some of that 24 gauge, which is equivalent to 0.5mm wire, to draw the mane together. Now this is what gives your unicorn piece its sense of rigidity, and it's what will make it a really long-lasting piece of art. So I'm going to be working with around about 10 to 12 inches of the 0.5, which is 24 gauge wire. I'm working in silver plated copper German style wire, so it's a little bit springy, not overly soft. What I'm going to do is wind the wire on to begin with, on that long extended tail of the wire down the bottom. Now if it's easier for you, you can take that up a little bit so you've got less things in your way. Now I'm going to wind this on around about 4 or 5 times. So I'm going to take the tail around. You can use your pliers with this if you prefer. I'll start off with my hands. So that's 3 wraps. And then as it starts to get a little bit more tense and tricky because it's close quarters, I'll use my pliers just to turn that around the upright. Taking the tail through. And then over one last time. And then I'm just going to squeeze the coil gently. Now what you'll see is the end of the finer gauge wire, if I just bring that up to you here, is on the front, and I don't want that to be on the front. I want that to be round the back. So I'm just going to very gently turn that coil around until the end of the wire sits on the back like so. Tightening that coil up, and then I'm going to flip the design over on its side like so, and just slide that gently down. Now all we're going to do now is a figure of 8 weave, which will join the elongated tail and our start point together. So I need that coil to sit next to the start point, and because it gets larger towards the bottom and it's smaller at the top, I'm just going to pinch that with my non-dominant hand. Now you have an open end of wire here, so you don't want to start winding on too close to that end. So pinching those two sections together, the finer gauge wire has coiled around this section, gone down the centre. I'm going to bring the tail up into the middle section, and then I'm going to wrap 3 times around our start point. So that's 1 and 2 and 3. And I'm going to ensure that that is nice and firm and tight and neat. Now, normally this would be a problem having an end section next to a coiled section, but by the time we get down to the base, what will happen is that this will start to become really strong and it will be much less of a risk. This is actually a little bit lower down on this demonstration piece, so if it concerns you that this section of coiling might slip off the end, you can simply start a little bit further down like so. Now all we're going to do from here on in is 3 wraps on one side down the centre, 3 wraps on the other side, and I'm going to do this in an open basket weave. So that's 1 and 2 and 3. Each time I do 3 wraps, I'm going to tighten those coils up, take the wire down the centre, up and around. That's 1 and 2 and 3. Tighten those coils up, swap sides. What I'm endeavouring to do is keep a similar distance between each set of 3 coils, 1 and 2 and 3. Now you could achieve this with a lighter gauge wire, but in order for this to be a long-lasting piece of art, I elected to use the 24 gauge, which is equivalent to 0.5mm. So I'm going to try and keep those zigs and zags of a similar size, and you can see we're still making a larger space as we move down. It's flaring as we go, so that's 1 and 2 and 3. Zigzagging over to the other side, 1 and 2 and 3. And you can just give those a little tighten up. They will be covered by beads, but I kind of like them to be neat anyway. We're going to continue zigging and zagging down, 1 and 2 and 3. And we're building up strength in the piece as we go. Now, if you wanted to make this in an even heavier gauge wire, you absolutely can. What you'll find in an even heavier gauge is that it's more tricky to get these pointy sections. And I think it looks quite nice with the pointy sections. So your other option would be to hammer the frame before you add the finer gauge wire. I've chosen not to do that today because this is perfectly adequate strength-wise. So again, as I go, each time I've done a couple of coils, I'm just going to tighten them up. And I'm going to finish off just on this side. And what I will do here is we'll use whatever wire I've got left to coil around and around and around. Now you may have noticed that it just started to go over the top of itself there. Just simply take it back half a step and move it on forwards. Now if they start to open up those coils, you can pinch really firmly with your non-dominant hand and then just continue until you've used whatever remaining wire you have. Now if you wanted to make this much more woven and close those pieces a little bit closer together, you would need more of the lighter gauge wire. So I'm just going to finish that section off, and then we're going to turn that bottom segment into a coil. As you get towards the end of the wire, it can sometimes be a little bit brutal on your fingertips, so I tend to switch to pliers for those last few turns. So the tail we've got down here, it's not the actual tail of the unicorn, it's the tail of the wire. What I'm going to do is trim that to about 1.5 inches with my flush cutters. So we've got a section of wire, never throw that away, you can always use that later. And then what we're going to do is pop in with our round nose pliers just to turn a coil on this last section. So again, quite close to the tip of the pliers as you go. You can make that large or small, it's entirely up to you. You could even have that slightly open coiling if you prefer. I start with round nose pliers and then switch to my bent chain nose pliers. Once you get all the way to the end, what you can start to do is include the coiling of the wire just here. If you use a significantly longer length of your weaving wire, you can get a really pretty effect, which will show on the final piece as well. Let me just grab that back. it's just harder to work with, especially if you're new to wire work. So the choices are yours. If you use a much longer section of wire, you get a more decorative effect. So just pop that back out of the way, and then we will continue working with our unicorn. So they're slightly different sizes. I mean, if you wanted to replicate them exactly, you may wish to photograph or photocopy and then create a dark line drawing in a permanent marker, and then you can copy that exactly. So your basic unicorn shape is really cool in and of itself, but the beads that come in the Unicorn Bliss Colour Trends bead box do lend themselves so perfectly to this design. I'm going to show you the order in which I chose to use them and where to put them next. So I'm going to work with an offcut of my 24 gauge 0.5mm wire. This is around about 10 inches, which I believe should be just enough for the project I have in mind. So I've pre-sorted my beads. This is the section for the mane. This is the section for the unicorn horn. And then we've got some little add-ons for a bit later on. So I've just popped that back over to one side. What I'm going to do to begin with is start winding on my finer gauge wire. Now this, as I say, is the 0.5, which is 24 gauge, and I'm just going to, if the wire would like to behave, wrap on 3 times around the outside. I will be sliding that down in just a second, but it's just to make my life easier. I'm going to take that tail and draw it all the way around at least 3 times. If you particularly had an extended length of wire to hand, you might want to fill this entire segment from where the ear starts down to the top of that doubled mane section. So if I just turn that around 3 times to begin with, you could fill that if you wanted to. But where we want to start the wire crossing over is just below the top here, where you've got the 2 sections. You've got the inner mane section and the outer mane section. So the first thing I'm going to do is have a look at my design, and let's replicate this piece here. Too many unicorns in the way. What a nice problem to have. So I'm going to start with one of these textured, it's like a stardust texture, and these are flattened disc spacers, but they've got a lovely manoeuvrability to them. They're shaped. That's the word I was looking for. So I've wound my wire on 3 times onto the outer mane section. It's coming up and over the top. I'm going to find the end of that wire and grab my first stardust textured spacer. Now if I hold them up sideways, you can see they're kind of domed, so I'm going to put the wire through the concave side and up out the surface like so. So very simply, I'm just going to twist that so that the bend that occurs in the bead now sits over the back of the mane, and I'm going to grab a spare one. Whoops. Might be better if I grab that with a pair of pliers, actually. So you can see the bead is almost like bent in half but not folded down the centre, and we want that bend to sit on the outer side of the outer mane. I'll pop that one back out of the way. What we're going to do is then draw the wire across. It's come up through the centre of that bead, and it's now going to go down inside the main frame. And what I'm going to do is wrap the tail of this wire just one time around the inner mane section. And what I'm going to do is zoom in for you now. So if I just hold that super still and pull nice and tight like so, I'm going to push the wire so that it comes underneath. So you can see that's nice and trapped now. What I'm going to do is find a gap in the weaving on the outer mane section, and I'm going to wrap once around just the outer. So that tail's going through between the inner and outer mane sections, like so. I'm going to pull that nice and firmly into position and then draw that back across the surface. So I'm just wrapping 3 times to begin with, and then the rest of the time it's just once to secure. The next piece I'm going to add is one of these floral beads. Now I imagine it's a material like lucite. These have got a flat back and a textured surface, so I need to find the tail of my wire, pop that through the flat side and up so that the textured surface now sits on the mane. So what you can do is find a gap between those 2 petals, Draw that wire down through the central section and then wrap one time around the inner main. So you may like to support with your fingers underneath, just to draw that all the way around. Pull that firmly into position, so we've wrapped once around the inner main. Push the tail of wire underneath, so it's passing across the back of the design now. This is all the while adding strength to your piece of art. Flipping it back over onto the front, I'm going to wrap once around the outer main section. Again, I'm going to keep zoomed in for as long as I can. I'm going to pinch that all together whilst I draw around once, pull that firmly into position, and draw the wire across the surface. Now I'm going to repeat this a couple of times now until all of the beads that I wanted to use are in the correct order. So for the sparkly stardust spacers, it's on the concave side. I had to think really hard then. Draw that down so that the line in the spacer sits super neatly. Draw the wire all the way around through the central section and then wrap one time around the inner main segment. You may just need to work to find a safe place for that to come up through. This is quite a firm wire to work with for weaving, so you might need to grab hold of the end with your pliers and draw that through. So again, crossing over the back, wrapping once around the outside main. I'm going to put that down, grab my next, I'm going to say lucite. Sarah, I'm sure you'll tell me if it's not lucite. Sit the flower onto the section of woven main that we created. Find a gap between those two petals, draw the wire down into the central section and wrap once around the inner main. And what you don't want to do is wrap in between the 3 wraps, so you may just have to work a little bit harder sometimes to find the right gap. There we go, there it is. So I'm going to pull that up through, make sure that that wire is coming in between those 2 petals. And then, as I say, because it's quite a firm wire to work with, you might need to employ your pliers just to bring that through smoothly. Take the tail all the way across the back, and then we're going to finish off wrapping once around the outer main section. Pull that through tightly. And then we're going to finish off with our last sparkle spacer disc. I'm sure Sarah will be able to tell you what they're actually called. Pop that in the concave side, get it to sit so that the line sits actually on the outer main. Pull the wire over the top, and then we're going to wrap one time around the inner main section. You may wish to pull that through with pliers, all the way across the back. And we've got just enough space here to wrap one more time around the outer main segment, like so, before drawing that back across the top. Now you don't have to add the tassel if you don't want to. I think it looks super cute. So I'm just going to add that tassel into position and then wrap exactly as I have done the preceding time. So that's once around the inner frame wire. And then we're going to assess the situation and see where I want to finish off. Now what you can do if you'd like to, I'll wrap a second and a third time just here for security's sake. And then I think if I bring the wire up the centre and second time pass it through the tassel, so we're in between the inner and the outer main now, and then take that over the back. Now this is going to prevent the tassel from moving around too much, and I'm just going to pass it across the back. I'm not wrapping on the outer main, but what I am going to do is finish off with 3 wraps on the frame just at the bottom of the inner main section. So that's 1, 2 and 3. Give that a squeeze to get it nice and firm. Flip, and then we're going to take our flush cutters and trim away, making sure that that last little bit goes in the scrap pot. Make sure you only cut the bit you want to cut. Always look twice. As they say, measure twice, cut once. And then give that a gentle squeeze to make sure everything's neat and tidy. So in and of itself, you've got a really cool unicorn shape to begin with. But what I will do now is show you how to add in those blue beads up the unicorn horn. In this next section of the tutorial, I'm going to show you how to add the beads to make the unicorn's horn, and also the dangle sections that make it really pretty artwork to hang in your window. They will beautifully catch the light. So for this next section, we're going to use these 4 mid-size, really beautifully finished faceted rondelle beads in this gorgeous, I don't know quite what you'd call this colour. Very, very pretty though. And I'm also going to be working with some shorter offcuts of the 0.5 or 24 gauge wire. I'm working with around about 6 or 7 inches here, so it's not a huge amount of wire that you need. Always worth hanging on to those offcuts. So we need to start down at the base of the unicorn's horn. Just pick a side where it makes you happy. And what we're going to do is wrap on at least 3 times. If you want to, you can always wrap 3 times, and then you know that if any of these are visible, that there will be symmetry to your piece. The reason I wrap 5 times on the beginning of the outside of that main section is because it's integral to the strength of the design. However, if you wrapped 3 times, it wouldn't be the end of the world. So I'm going to get that coil to sit nice and tightly before I just flip that over. Trim away any excess, make sure that does go in the scrap pot because those little bits of wire can really get stuck. I'm just going to tidy that end section really neatly so that it doesn't catch on anything. So what we've got is our finer gauge wire coming over the surface of the design now, and we're going to go from one side to the other over the surface. So I'm going to find the end of my wire and just add on the first of those beads. It's going to sit in the gap sideways and go at quite a jaunty angle like so. So I'm now going to wrap 3 times around the right hand side of the horn, and we've gone over the top. You can take the leading edge through like so, that's 1, leading edge through 2, and then you've got 3 visible wraps. Cross that on the back just above the section where the bead is visible, and we're going to wrap that 3 times on the far side. So it's coming from underneath on the left hand side of that horn now, and we're going to wrap 3 times, once and twice and a 3rd time. And I'm just going to make sure that those coils are nice and tight. Bit of an angle for the bead to replicate the little kind of spiral that goes up on a unicorn horn. So I'm going to find my 2nd bead, add that onto the end of the wire and allow that to sit in position. So again, it's sitting over the surface, wire comes from the top to the top, around the right hand side of that horn. Draw that so that it's nice and firm in its position. So that's once and twice and a 3rd time. Across the back of the horn, and then repeat that another 2 times. It would be lovely to have some way of making the horn slightly smaller, but I think these beads are so perfect for the design. That's why I kept the size pretty similar all the way across, and I think with the wire just skirting around the outsides of the beads, you can really tell what it's supposed to represent. So there's bead number 3 across the top with our channel setting. That's 1, 2 circuits, and then a 3rd circuit. That's gone slightly loose, so I'm just pinching super hard while I tighten that up. If you turn it on its side slightly, you can just tighten those coils up slightly, like so. Across the back, and then wrap 3 times on the left hand side, coming from underneath around just the left hand side. That's 1, that's the 2nd time, and then the 3rd time like so. Tighten up those coils before we add in our last bead. There we go. Sits down into position. And then we're going to finish with 3 wraps at the top on the right hand side. So the wires come through, gone over the top of the frame, added that around, and then we'll finish off on the back like so. Trim away. Now always place your cutters, check you're cutting the right wire, trim that away, and then smooth that end down into position. Always being careful that you're not going to scratch a bead or smash a bead. So we're putting pressure on the wire and nothing else. Let me just pop that down so you can see. I think it looks like a unicorn horn. I hope that you agree. What I'm going to do now is pre-prepare some little drops which we can hang off a frame if we choose to make a frame. As it stands, your unicorn is good to go. You can simply hang that from the tip of the horn. That's why the bead doesn't go all the way through to the top. There's enough space for you to put a jump ring to add it to a bail of your choice. If you wanted to wear it as jewellery, you absolutely can, or you can hang it as is. For the next section, I'm just going to create those drops in advance, and then we'll have a look at creating a frame for our unicorn cameo. So I've got my beads ready to create the little drops. I'm just going to pop my unicorn shape out of the way for now. I've got some scrap sections of that 16 gauge or 1.25mm wire. They range from around about 7 inches down to about 4.5 to 5 inches, and these are plenty for what we need. One thing I would say is when you're working with scraps, make sure that you've got nice tidy ends to begin with. So those two just needed a little bit of a trim. Get that out into the scrap pot. Let's have a look at the other ends, and let's give that a little trim just there. Tiny little section of wire, just makes it so much easier if you forget to trim that later. So for the central drop, what I'm going to do is start by generating a coil. This is the slightly longer of the scraps of wire, just under 7 inches, around about 6 inches maybe. I'm going to start by generating a coil. So quite close to the tip of those pliers. I'm going to draw that around in a circular form before switching over to my bent chain nose pliers to create a second spiral. You could even just go halfway around, so 1.5 times, because we're kind of going to hide this away a little bit. So I'm going to push really firmly. It is much more tricky in this heavier gauge of wire, however, so very worth it for the longevity that you will achieve. So what I'm going to do is just pop that down for a second and bring in my demonstration piece so you can have a look at the dangly sections that fall away at the bottom. You can obviously use whatever bead order you like, but I'm going to show you the one that I've created here just because it's something a little bit different. So I've got my 1.5 spiral at the bottom of that elongated section of wire, and I'm just going to make sure that that's nice and smooth and flattened out in case there are any kinks. So we're going to start with one of these beautiful flared bead caps, and we're just going to drop it over that spiral. And in that way you have a seamless end to your dangly section. We're then going to add in a series of beads. So I'm going to go for one of these spacers with the magnificent multicoloured stones, little rhinestones I imagine in them. That's popped all the way down to the bottom before we have one of these gorgeous quality bead caps. Now I do love these because they're not very, very super fine punchings that you will get from some suppliers. These are really beautiful quality, good weight, and will hold their form. Now that's going to go upside down like so before we add in this milky opal-like stone. Now what you do need to be careful with is just to make sure that your wire is super flat. Now you can see there's a gentle bend at the top here. If you struggle with this section, what you could do is size down your wire to a lighter gauge. For instance, an 18 gauge wire would work just as well. There's really no weight on these, and I don't want you to damage your beads. So if you do have slightly kinked wire, maybe just take that down a level in terms of size. So I'm going to go for another spacer, and then like a milky opalescent rondelle, and then another spacer. These are fabulous. And then another milky rondelle until we get that lovely drop shape. Now that is going to be defined. The orientation of your bead cap is defined by your spiral. It's narrower on one orientation than the other. So what we're going to do is find out which is forwards. Now, if you want to have it hanging that way, you absolutely can. I'm going to go for the slightly broader way. I'm going to draw all of those beads down in the relevant order. I'm going to come very, very close to the top there, being careful and respectful of the beads. I'm going to put a very sharp forwards bend on. And what you'll notice is because I've had my pliers next to the bead, there is a gap. And that's for a good reason. It's to allow your beads to breathe. Whilst they don't need oxygen, they do need space not to be under pressure. So we've got far more wire than we actually need, but as this was an offcut to begin with, I'm quite happy with that. And what I'm going to do is to create an open loop. So I'm going to start by forming a half circle with those pliers, and I'm going to pop the pliers back in and draw the tail of wire over the top and around. Now open loops are really handy in designs like this. There's no real weight coming down, and I'll show you how to strengthen that. So in with the flush cutters, flush side to the section we're keeping. And what I'm going to do is make sure that that sits down now in a very flat form, creating that circular shape. You can see where the end is, where we just created that cut. And I'm going to support that with my finger and thumb to make sure that the bead is kept away from the action my pliers are giving, which is a very firm squeeze. You can see I've dented the wire so it's now more oval than round. And that is so that that remains a very strong component, and you should end up with lovely, long-lasting art. Now I'm going to show you how to make one of these. It's a very, very similar process, but I don't need to do it for you twice. So one of these scraps of wire is around about 4 inches, and for this one I'm going to do a complete circuit of the round nose pliers twice. So I started off by creating my first circuit with the round nose pliers, bringing those back in, scooching all the way around to make quite a large bead shape, a large coil rather, to replicate the large bead that we're going to use next. So I'm going to pinch really firmly and draw that coil away. We want that to sit centrally on that line, and again you will want to make sure that the wire is warm and straight before we add some drops on. So I've got this huge Aurora Borealis, followed by a gorgeous lilac crackle. I'm sure these all have names, so I'm just making up my own. And then we've got this gorgeous rose quartz colour, almost a pastel opaque cube. I'm going to drop that down in the last position, finishing off in exactly the same way as the preceding item. So gripping carefully, making sure that we're not harming our beads. The orientation for the spiral is flat, so we're going to come forwards with that bend, like so. And then we're going to generate that circular form and do exactly the same as we did before. So we've made a half circle, pop the pliers back in, draw the tail all the way around. Just flatten that down and make sure you're happy with the shape and form. Trim away the excess, like so, making sure that you only cut the correct piece of wire. The reason I tell you this frequently is because I've done it myself more than once. So we're going to make sure that we're happy with that shape and give that a really hearty squeeze. Again, taking care to protect your beads from the action you are making with those pliers. Now what I did with the piece in question is have one spiral going one way and one going the other way. So once you've created that first spiral, you need to make sure that you've got one going in one direction, and then when you add the forwards bend, have the spiral in the opposite direction. So you can see here, one is going clockwise, one is going anti-clockwise. Now if you go wrong and you make two the same, all that will happen is that you'll be able to see the cut on the front rather than the smooth on the front. It's not the end of the world. So I'm just going to put those to one side, and then we'll add them onto the frame at the very end of the demonstration. So for my unicorn cameo, what I've done is created a mostly oval frame with a wrapped loop at the top, wired the unicorn on quite a jaunty angle into the framework, and then added these dangles off the bottom so that you've got some movement in your artwork if it's a sunlight catcher. So I'm going to be working again with 16 gauge or 1.25mm wire for this framework, and I'm going to employ one of my bangle mandrels to help me shape this up. Bangle mandrel. Now you can use a can of beans or a bottle of soda, whatever it is you have to hand to help form your shapes. I've got two bangle mandrels. I've got a perfectly round one which tapers from really barely an inch and a bit at the top to quite a large size at the bottom, and I also have an oval. So I'm going to use the oval mandrel today to help me. If you don't have an oval form to work with, the other option is a small oval, like this, which comes from Beadalon. These are magnificent. I've got a round one and an oval one. These will also help you form any wireframe shapes that you need. So you could use either of these. It's about the same size as the large one. If you struggle to form a shape large enough, then you can always find a household object or just gently prise the section open, and I will show you how to do that now. So I'm just going to use my small mandrel, my Beadalon mandrel, which is really useful for creating designs which require frames. Now, as you can see, the mandrel isn't quite large enough for the frame that I would need. However, you can still use them. I'm utilising 16 gauge wire, which is 1.25 millimetre, and I've got around about 18 to 20 inches, and I'm going to give that a really lovely warm through. And what I'm going to do is use the longitudinal side, set my mandrel in landscape mode rather than portrait mode, and use that to create a firm half circular shape. What you can then do is draw that down a little bit. Let's make sure that we're happy with that form. You can draw your wire across the surface and then close it around at the top. So you can create much larger shapes using a mandrel that you wouldn't necessarily think would be large enough for your needs. So rather than trying to acquire larger and larger mandrels, you can be smart about how you use the ones you already have. So I'm going to pop that out of the way, and we're going to have a look at how we think the unicorn might sit inside the frame. So what I'm going to do is just open this out slightly, and then I'm going to generate probably a teardrop shape at the top rather than a perfect oval. So I'm just going to very carefully open up the design on either side. And this is fairly classic for when I'm making pendants. I will do a lot of it by hand rather than using a specific frame. So going by eye, what I want to do is attach my unicorn design by the nose and the back and front, the back of the mane and the chest area. You don't have to have more than 3 points of contact, and for this I would be using just small offcuts of that 24 gauge or 0.5 millimeter gauge wire. But to begin with, what I'm going to do is just show you a very quick way to create a frame. So I'm happy with how that is going to sit in terms of size, and what I'm going to do is find the point at which those wires cross over, pop my pliers into position and make one of those an upright, and the other one, if I support the wires like so, I'm going to draw that flat to begin with, so that comes off towards 9 o'clock rather than going up at a diagonal. I'm going to support the wire that's passing underneath, which is this one, and I'm going to draw that back around the neck of the upright that we've just created. Now, before you start going wrapping crazy, let's see if our unicorn is going to fit inside the frame. We can make that fit. That will absolutely work. I like the idea of having the unicorn's horn coming away. So let's pop that down and out the way. And what you would then need to do is to support these wires. Let's give that a really tight pinch to begin with. Hold that really, really firmly whilst you take the tail all the way around. Now, this will, on occasion, bring your form out of shape, which is why I'm not overly fussed about the actual size being perfect. And I'm just going to take that one last time around the back before I trim that away. So I do need to tidy this up. That coil has gone a little bit awry, so I just take a few minutes to make sure that that's neat and tidy before drawing it all together like so. And just squishing that so that it all sits neatly in a spring-like coil. So you can see we have slightly lost our shape, but we can easily reform that. So I'm just going to put a little bit of heat onto the side where it's dropped a little bit. And then we've done wrapped loops a couple of times together over the last few weeks. So what I think I'll do here, this is going to be the front of my design. I'm going to make sure that I'm happy with how everything is sitting. I'm just going to do an open loop here for today. So you could use your, hold on a second, bail making pliers, which are always wonderful to have. And I've made a really large loop at the top there. Do you know what? I think we'll double wrap it. That'll be something we haven't seen before. I don't want you to get bored. So I'm trying to think of different things to show you. Now, rather than doing a single wrapped loop or doing an open loop, I'm going to double wrap this neck section. So we've made that circle using our bail making pliers. I'm going to take that tail now all the way around over the top of the first spiral we made. So what you'll end up with is a really strong neck to the design. And then all the way around. Now this can sometimes dictate where your front and back is, depending on where that wire finishes up. So I'm going to give that a squeeze and try to get that wrapped away as neatly as possible. Give that a squish and get that to sit neatly down. So we've double wrapped the loop at the top. If you wanted to, I've actually got beads left over from my mix, and you could put something over the surface if you really didn't like the loop that you've made. But what it will need to do is just reform that shape. So it's gone off to the side slightly, so all I would do is pop the mandrel or the form into position, centralise it, give that a squeeze, take that down to the bottom and reform it so that it sits symmetrically. So you can usually use a form that isn't large enough to create something much larger. So I'm going to show you now how to add the unicorn to the frame using tiny scraps of 24 gauge or 0.5mm gauge wire. So you can really decide what sort of angle you'd like your unicorn to sit. And if you decide that you want to have him inside the frame, you can make that fit like so, or you could have him coming out of the frame. I actually quite like it. I think it looks quite interesting having him coming out of the frame. However, one key point is to get the front of the neck attached at the base of your framework. So I'm going to turn it upside down. And what I'm going to do is take this tiny scrap, it's about 2.5 inches long. I'm going to start by wrapping one end around the base of that framework we've just created. This is in the 6 o'clock position, we've inverted it. Now I think probably, because I want this to be super strong and last forever, I want to wrap this 5 times today. We've been doing it 3 times on pretty much every other part of the design, but this is pretty structural, so I would say an absolute minimum of 3 turns. I'm going to go for 5 because I know I have enough scrap in hand. So that's 4 times that I can see. So I'm going to pop the unicorn out of position for a moment, gently grip that wire coil and draw that tail around so I get my 5th wrap. I'd quite like this to sit just off centre, because what that means is when I add the dangle in, the dangle can be central rather than the base of the unicorn. So this is the front of my design. So I'm going to pop his neck into position just off to one side, like so. So that's just past 6 o'clock, going clockwise. The finer gauge wire is underneath. So I'm going to pop the unicorn into position and draw the tail of the wire up and around so that it passes once around both the base of the unicorn and that outer framework. And I'm going to assess if I can get a second turn in that gap. It depends how tight you made that shape. I think 2 wraps is going to be perfect. And I'm going to bring the tail around and wrap 5 times on the frame. What I would tend to do then, for a sense of symmetry and professionalism, is continue to wrap 5 times on the frame, twice around the unicorn and the frame, 5 times on the frame. And in that way, it just looks like you've thought about things a little bit. So again, I'm going to trim away that little bit of wire off the end. So we've got quite a lot of use out of our scrap. I'm going to make sure that those ends are nice and tidy and try and draw that coil together. Flip that over to the other side and we can look and see how neat that is. Once I'm happy with how that's sitting, what I will do is just give that a gentle squeeze to lock that wire shape into position. And then I'm going to decide where else I want to add my unicorn to the framework. So I've got space in here on the coil, down at the base of the neck, and also on the nose. So you will need at least 3 points of contact. So what I'm going to do now is just wire in exactly the same way the nose, and then down here at the base. So I've got my wire on a reel. I'm just going to grab myself a couple more lengths. I've used up all my offcuts, which is always good news in terms of the environment, to not be wasteful. So I don't need a huge amount. What I'm going to do is make sure that I'm happy with how that's sitting and that the base of the neck is just slightly to one side of dead central bottom. So that means I'm going to tilt him slightly further back, switch the design on its side, and then I'm going to wrap twice around the nose and the frame, and then 5 times around the frame either side. So that's 1, 2. I'm going through this quite quickly now because I've just shown you in detail. The process is exactly the same. So on the back we're going to trim away, and of course you would, as always, squish that to make sure it's nice and neat. And then the tail of wire on the other side needs to also wrap 5 times. So I'm just going to put the leading edge through. Whoops-a-daisy, there goes my light. Once, twice, 3 times. Welcome to counting with Jem. And 5. I'm going to trim that tail away. I've got yet more scrap sections now to work with. And just give that a little rotate. Tighten up the coils. Give it a squeeze. And then we need to decide whereabouts on this side we're going to work. So what I would do is just open out that coil slightly. And I'm probably going to tie around the coiled section because I can hide this wire inside. Now there's a trick to this, and that's not to get stressed. So I'm going to flip the design over. I'm going to wrap 5 times to begin with so that I know I've got a good starting point. So that's once, twice, all the way around. And I'm going to make sure, even though this is on the back, that it is 5 wraps that we're going to see. So I think we've got 4 so far. I just need to scooch those up together and then tighten them. You can do that by turning the coil around on the framework until you get rid of all that looseness. And then what we're going to do is bring the wire up inside the frame here. It's going to just pass behind that little floral dropper. And what I'm going to do is simply take the wire over the surface of that coiled section and draw it back through. You can just push those petals out the way and then draw that around the back of the framework. And then we're just going to finish off by wrapping 5 times on the frame on the other side, and you won't even know that it's there. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. You may capture some of the petals in your wrapping, but I don't think it's a massive problem. Trim away, and you'll find that you're nice and secure now, and you've got that lovely coil which you can, if you want to, you can draw that over the surface a little bit more. You're not going to lose your unicorn. He is static now. So I will show you with one of these pieces how to add on to the base, which is very simply to make sure that that's nice and strong as we did earlier. We're going to open this sideways as you would a jump ring, like so. We're going to pop this one, which is the long drop, over so that it will sit in the middle. Close up your openable loop and then flip it over the top. So that one sits in the centre. And then you've got these 2 to go either side, and they'll nestle up really nicely because of the size of the beads. I'm going to bring in the demonstration piece so you can see how that works. So for this one, the base of the unicorn's neck sat slightly to the right of dead centre bottom. By the time you've added those other 2 drops in, they sit the right distance apart because of the size of the bead, so you don't need to worry about the wrapping. So you can see here that this was attached by the coils, by the base of the neck, and up on the nose. Now, if you had a panicky moment and you didn't think it would last, you've got plenty of opportunities to join the horn of your unicorn to that frame. So if I just put those 2 side by side, you can see the one we've made live together now, and the one I made earlier. We can just add these on in a moment. I also had a couple of beads left over. So I made a pair of earrings just here, And I've also got another 4 beads that I've just popped onto a loop to work with as well. So we got 2 entire unicorns, a pair of earrings and some spares, all out of the one box. Well, thank you so much everyone at Jessie James on Facebook here today, this evening, this afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. I hope you've had a lot of fun with me today creating the Unicorn Bliss unicorn cameo design. Now, as I said earlier on, I would have that as window art or a sunlight catcher or something like that. If you wanted to size it down slightly, then you absolutely could. There's enough beads that are absolutely perfect in the Unicorn Bliss box to fit the brief. So you could make that smaller and wear it if you wanted to. If you had noticed, I'm wearing a really funky double dip ice cream, which I will be bringing to you at Jessie James Summer Camp on the 2nd of August. I do hope that you'll be able to join us then. And I look forward to coming back with you again very, very soon for another wire work afternoon / evening / morning, wherever you are, whatever time it is. Take care, and I'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.